and hopefully that will work. So I'm going to start by just giving a quick, brief overview of fearless emotion management. And these are all skills. It's a method that you can use to better understanding what anxiety and depression, PTSD are. Um, as I go throughout the slides, you'll notice these little thought bubbles, and I want to emphasize that when I click on these, I'm clicking to spiritual links, so links of teachings from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. But I don't want anybody confusing my interpretation of these scriptures and beliefs as supported by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints or BYU Idaho. They're my own interpretations. This method contains 4 steps: finding yourself and your safety, easing your lizard brain, see down here your hindbrain, assuring your security guard, that's your amygdala, and learning how to repeat these processes to literally grow hope in the brain. Today, for those who haven't participated before, you can go to sites.google.com, and as JC was saying earlier, you can watch a video. If you put it on 2 times speed, you can actually watch it in 17 minutes and get a really good overview of this process. Today, we're going to focus on assuring your security guard. So I'm going to jump over to how we can do that. Let me share a different screen here. So you can also get these slides online, by the way. So I want to talk today about depression. So one of the things that we can do, like if in our amygdala, this is a non-conscious region of our brain, I refer to it as the security guard. But one of the things that we can do with our own amygdalas is begin to change our relationship with them. So I want to start today by showing you one way that the research has shown we can really begin to change our relationship. And this is, we can actually anthropomorphize things like depression or sadness. So the research shows that we could actually begin to think of our emotions as a separate person, right? A different part of ourselves. Now, of course, the depression is in us, so we don't literally have another person. But by beginning to think about a person or our emotions as another person, we can really do a great job at psychologically distancing ourselves from that. And it actually, the research is interesting. We don't want to do this with the positive emotions that we have or with spiritual things, because we literally will create that distance. So it's useful to do it with the sadness and depression, not so helpful to do with the positive emotions of happiness. But I'm going to invite you to follow along now, if you would like, and just close your eyes and imagine your sadness coming to life. This happens all the time in the movies. Emotions are given human form, and that's what we're doing. The more human you can make it, the better. But imagine your sadness coming to life as an independent person that's not attached to you and can be easily separated from you. So really get clear. Maybe think of the sort of person it would be like. What would sadness look like if it were a separate person from you? Really try and get clear on what sadness would look like as a human form. And now I would invite you also to see kind of what would their personality or their conversational style be like. What is the way that person talks to you? What is their overall personality and the way they interact with you? And if you could give this person a name, this part of you, the sadness, if you gave it a name, maybe think of what that would be. Some of you might be thinking that this is kind of bizarre, that we're trying to separate this part. All we're trying to do is step back a little bit and take a better, clearer look at the sadness in you, or the depression, however you label it. And you'll see now, I'm going to kind of click on a thought bubble here, so a spiritual link here, that you might notice that this is a very similar process to what we would find in King Benjamin's discourse in Mosiah 4:30. He invites us to watch ourselves, to watch our thoughts, and to watch our words. At no point does he tell us to get rid of our thoughts, get rid of ourselves. He tells us to watch ourselves. In order to do that, we have to stand back and look. So by creating this anthropomorphized sadness in us, or depression, we're actually now able to stand back and actually look at our depression. Psychologically, we know that there's some tremendous benefit to this. We can actually begin to see that we are not our depression. We are not our sadness. It's one part of our experience, but it's not who we are. It's something that's taking place within us. So I'm going to jump back here, but it's at this point that I would love if anybody has any questions. One, I hope you're writing questions down as we go, so that when I'm done with these little modules that I'm sharing, that if you have questions, we can continue to talk about them. So if there is anybody that has a question at this point, just unmute yourself and ask that. And JC, I want to check in with you just so that I know if you can see the slides and you can hear me okay.
Yeah, everything's looking good.
Okay, great, thank you.
One minor question. How long did it take you to learn to pronounce anthropomorphize correctly?
Well, I'm pretty sure I probably mixed it up a little bit already. I can't always say it correctly.
It's very impressive.
So I'm not getting any other questions. This is just one of many different ways that we have to deal with things like sadness and depression. And again, the research is pretty amazing on this. It can literally change someone's desire on what they eat. They actually base some of this research on, like, will you choose a salad or a pie when it comes to something to add to your meal? And for people who can anthropomorphize their sadness, kind of turn their sadness into a person, they're actually far more likely to make a healthy choice in what they eat, which actually makes sense, because we know that once the body has gone into a depression mode or a hibernation mode, the body starts craving like higher calorie, higher density foods to conserve energy. So it makes sense there.
I have a question.
Yes.
Is it possible, or is it productive to anthropomorphize different emotions, like maybe anxiety or stress?
Absolutely. That's a really great question. And yes, anything that we want to begin to distance ourselves from, we want to be careful when we come to spiritual things, sacred things that we want to be close to, feelings of love and those types of things, because the moment we do start to anthropomorphize, we actually distance ourselves psychologically. So we actually want to do this with anything that we don't want that to be our identity. So it can be anxiety or trauma or depression, or if someone's experiencing OCD, we actually end up doing this quite a bit with obsessive compulsive disorder, but kind of creating this other person that we can begin to just observe and look at. But yes, anything that we're really wanting to decrease its effect on us, we can do this with it. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome. So if there are no other questions about that particular intervention, and again, we're talking about assuring our security guard. What we're really trying to do here, let me see if I'm going to switch screens here for just a second so that I can show you what we're talking about. What we're really trying to do here is get the frontal lobes more involved. You see here this little person. When we anthropomorphize, we're actually using our frontal lobes, our conscious self, to begin looking at our emotional and physical experiences, these unconscious responses in our body. And when we do that, we actually literally start growing the connective tissue. You'll see ACC here, that's anterior cingulate cortex, that we're actually growing this tissue, and the stronger and the more dense this tissue becomes, the greater capacity you have to respond to emotions and events in the way that you would like to. So we're actually, by assuring your security guard, we're actually growing this relationship with your own non-conscious self. So I'm going to go back to this, and I want to talk to you about another way to begin to view our experiences. So let me go back here. So when I was a teenager, I was about 15 or 16, I was interested in flying, so I started taking private pilot lessons until I ran out of money. It was expensive. But one of the first things I did was I was taught to not fly by the seat of my pants. So anybody who's flown in small aircraft probably has a good idea of what this means. Because of the three-dimensional space in which airplanes fly, there's lots of different forces at play on the human body. So, for example, you see this plane right here relative to the horizon. You can tell that it's turning. Well, this person, if they couldn't see directly, they would just feel themselves being pushed down into their seat. And if they had no reference point, they would assume that they're falling, right? Or they're assumed, in fact, actually, that they'd be climbing because of the pressure on their seat. In small aircraft, this becomes even more difficult when visibility is low. So if it's nighttime or there's clouds, in small airplanes, the forces of gravity can really distort the body's perceptions of what's really happening. So because of this, lots of early pilots died. Right? They got over-reliant on their bodies, and of course their bodies didn't really have the correct information, and so they died. So pilots got together with engineers, and they started creating kind of some gadgets, some ways to kind of measure what is actually happening to the plane. So different things like airspeed indicators and altitude indicators, the attitude of the plane, if it's turning or not, what direction it's heading, how fast it's climbing or falling. All these turn out to be far, far more reliable than the body when it comes to flying small planes. And in fact, these are what allow pilots to be able to fly in low visibility conditions. It turns out the human body, when it comes to emotions, can often respond like flying a small airplane. So depression, and I'm just focusing on depression right now, but what it leads to is limbic system dominance. This is the non-conscious region of the brain, right? We have our amygdala, our security guard here, and we have our autonomic nervous system, or our lizard brain. That's what I refer to it as. But this, when a person's in a depressed state, this is what begins to help the person fly and to tell them what is or is not safe. And this is all great if you're a grizzly bear, by the way, and it's fall and the snow's starting to fall and there's very little food, and the limbic system gets involved and says, hey, this is getting dangerous, it's time to go into hibernation. That's really effective for immediate physical survival. Problem comes when maybe you're a student just trying to get to class, or maybe you're an employee just trying to get to your job, and somehow your security guard is seeing the environment as hopelessly dangerous. this is when the non-conscious part of the brain can begin giving information that is not accurate. So maybe you're in no physical danger at all, but depression is saying that you are. It's saying that your situation's hopeless. So what happens here is the security guard calls up the lizard brain and says, okay, the situation's hopeless. Let's use this dorsal vagal parasympathetic nerve to put the body into shutdown. We're going to shut down the frontal lobes and all the organs of the body to conserve energy. In other words, the body's going into hibernation. And hibernation is just another term for major depression disorder or major depressive episode. So what we want to do, because we are physically safe, we maybe want to begin to see that maybe our instruments would be more reliable here. So maybe my body is telling me that the situation is dangerous, but maybe I don't want to rely on my depression to tell me what is and is not true if I'm physically safe. So again, I'm assuming that a person is in a physically safe environment, then depression is not giving them helpful information. So if we look, for example, at maybe a person's airspeed. So in an aircraft, like we have to look at airspeed and not ground speed. 60 miles per hour in a car means that I'm traveling along the earth at 60 miles in an hour. But airspeed works differently. What I need to know is how fast the plane is moving through the air. So if we look at this bird, and I hope that this will work, we'll see that it appears to be holding still, but in fact, this bird's perception, the flow of air over its wing, it's probably traveling at 20 to 30 miles an hour airspeed. If you look here at this bird, you'll notice that sometimes it has to flap a little bit, otherwise it's going to be blown backwards. And this can be a lot like depression. The person's perception is they're not getting anywhere, and relative to the ground, that could be an accurate statement. But what it's not taking into account is there's a lot of headwind. So depression, maybe there's emotional stresses, there's physical stresses, there's work stresses that are going on. So just being able to maintain flight in a single spot is actually exactly what needs to be happening and exactly healthy, so that we don't need to get worried that we're not making headway here. Just staying afloat is a really good feat for that particular moment. So I'm clicking another thought bubble here as far as spiritual things. Elder Uchtdorf gave a really good description of this process that can maybe be really helpful. So in times when, for whatever reason, our bodies go into a depressed state, and by the way, there's a lot of reasons that can happen. So in the end, it all means that the brain is perceiving that the environment is hopelessly dangerous, but there can be chemical reasons for that, or there can be situational reasons. Whatever it is, it's likely that there's a lot of stress going on. And President Elder Uchtdorf does a really good job at walking us through that sometimes it's important just to keep flying. We don't maybe need to do extra things during that time period, further adding to the stress in our body, which would only further add to the depressive response in our bodies. Ooh, I don't know where that took me. So I'll stop sharing here for a second. So are there any questions about this particular way of understanding depression by using instrument panel rather than our body to tell us what's happening?
How much we can learn.
I have a question.
Yes.
once you like picture the person or like your emotions as a person, like
Yes.
how again should you use that to kind of control your own emotions?
Oh, okay. So that's a really good point. I'm bringing you back. So if we're going back to that anthropomorphizing, like we're actually viewing our emotions as a person, we're not doing that so that we can control that person. We're doing it so that we can just observe it. It gives us just a little bit of a distance. So I might be able to see that person that, oh, if it's my sadness, I can see, oh, I can see that person's really sad. I can see that they're feeling a lot of stress. Maybe they are having the threat of losing their job because of COVID-19, or they're having difficulty getting, but I can actually talk about that person rather than it being me. And there's something psychologically very powerful about that. So I'm not trying to control this depressed, sad person I've created out here. I'm trying to be able to talk with it and talk about it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And so once you like kind of talk through that, like what do you do with that? Do you just like kind of, does it help you just realize what's going on with yourself, or?
Yes. So the idea is that this is not a one-time thing, that this just becomes kind of a more permanent way of being with your own emotion. So that this is a person that it's going to show up when it wants to show up. We're not there to control when it does and doesn't show up. But instead, it gives us that distance where, just like an unwanted friend that's following us around, it's going to follow us around. But at least we can talk about it and to it. And this allows us, it actually frees up a lot of our mental and emotional energy to be able to focus then back on what's more relevant to the moment.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Are there any other questions so far? So I'm not getting any other questions at this point. Again, please write them down. If I'm going along and I'm saying something that's not helpful, please feel free to butt in and ask the question. I have one other thing that I'd like to talk about pertaining to depression. And that is, let me see, which one did I want to talk about today? Oh, this make meaning. So here's another thing. If we're talking about changing our relationship with our own self, with our security guard. So whatever scared our security guard, it might simply be that we can help it have a new meaning for that thing. So maybe something really bad has happened. Maybe you just had to go into isolation because of COVID-19, or something else has happened that's really been difficult and problematic. If we don't find meaning for that situation, our security guard will take over and put us into either a fight or flight or a freeze type response. But if we can find meaning for whatever difficulty is going on, we can actually change our own brain's reaction to the situation. So this is where finding meaning, discovering meaning, making meaning, even inventing meaning can be really powerful. So there's one way of saying this. So Eric Grecians, he's a Navy SEAL, and later became a governor. Some people like Navy SEALs, some people don't. But he talks about one of the reasons that we suffer is because we don't know the purpose of our struggle. And this turns out to be really similar to some other ideas that have been presented. If there is no meaning and there is no purpose to my current suffering, then I will actually become depressed, or I will become anxious. Instead of just experiencing the difficulty, I'm now adding to it because there's no meaning behind it. So Eric Grecian writes a book. He has his own method of maybe beginning to understand and turn difficulties and challenges into meaning. There's another one by David Goggins, another Navy SEAL. If you like their style of writing, there's a lot of Navy SEALs that have written books. In his, he comes from a particularly abusive background. It's David Goggins, and he got into the different special forces, several of them. He also became an ultra runner, distance runner, set world records in doing pull-ups, so many pull-ups in a row, lots of things that he did. But he did it all by changing the meaning of his history. So he turned a very abusive childhood into motivation. And he has his own method for doing that. And I do want to warn you, like, he definitely swears like a sailor. There's a lot of, I think part of the training for elite special forces is to learn how to use adjectives in new and unique ways, like very descriptive adjectives. So just be aware of that if you are interested in reading a book like his. But he has his own way of really turning something that was very traumatic and tragic into actual motivation. So he would actually say that I needed that to happen in order for my growth to occur. Probably something that most of you have heard in a very similar way is Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. So Viktor Frankl was put into Nazi concentration camps, and he had to do the same thing. So as he's literally on the verge of death, being kicked by a guard, he has to come up with meaning and understanding for what he's going through. And he talks about that, and he talks about how we can do a very similar thing, so that no matter the trauma that we're going through, if it has meaning, then it will lead to further depression. If it has meaning, it won't lead to anxiety or PTSD. So he talks about those. And let me see here. I think it's behind here. I want to click, since we're here at BYU Idaho, there's another book that can begin to help with this kind of thing. There's one by Jane Clayson Johnson. Many of us older people know her as a pretty prominent TV personality, news personality several years ago. And she is a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And she's collected a lot of stories about those with depression, and that it's far more common among our church membership than people realize, that there's a lot of people who are out there silently suffering. And just by beginning to understand that many other people are suffering and how they came to find meaning, how Jane Clayson Johnson describes her own process of that. She also goes into, she was caught up in toxic perfectionism herself, talking about, making sure if they're having guests, making the whole family take all the odds and ends and throw them upstairs so that the main level looked nice and clean for guests, so that people assumed she had her life in order when in fact she was feeling completely out of control. But learning about her story, that we're not all that different, can also help us understand that maybe part of this experience, part of experiencing depression, is actually meaningful and useful. So that's one way. And then we have Elder Holland. If you're really interested in learning about, maybe even though we can't understand the exact reasoning God allows us to suffer with depression or anxiety or other mental health disorders, Elder Holland does a really great job at talking about how we can better deal with this and find meaning in it, and talking about, so some of these talks, be therefore perfect eventually, and tomorrow the Lord will do wonders among you, meaning maybe not today, but it'll eventually come. And living after manner of happiness is a BYUI devotional that he gave once, that we aren't supposed to be happy all the time. Happiness lands occasionally like a butterfly on our shoulder when we're living after the manner of happiness. And then, of course, like a broken vessel, which many people have read and responded to. But one of the things that you can do to really assure your security guard, especially given the context of our doctrine, is really study these different talks from Elder Holland, and read them again and again to really help it sink in and change that relationship with your own security guard, with your own non-conscious self, that some of this is very useful. Find the meaning, find why it's useful to you, how it is that you're a different person because of it, and how that might be helpful. So one of the things that Elder Holland says is the first great commandment of all eternity is to love God with all our heart, might, mind, and strength. But the first great truth of all eternity is that God loves us with all his heart, might, mind, and strength. So getting really connected with that idea can begin to change our perception on our worth, which is really helpful, which then allows us to get more blood flow to our frontal lobes and allows us to begin to discover that there's actually meaning in our struggles, that they aren't meaningless. So does anybody have questions of anything we've talked about so far today? Any other questions about depression or how some of these ideas might apply?
Brother Johnson, like how could like a hormone influx affect depression? Could that like make it worse?
So, by the way, I want to emphasize that I'm a PhD, not an MD when it comes to Dr. Johnson. So in talking about this, I'm talking about my understanding of this process. But what we know is if somebody is in a depressed state, their brain is perceiving the environment as hopelessly dangerous, right? There's something coming in, some of the sensations of the body or thought processes or memories that are kind of causing the brain to tell the person it's time to withdraw, it's time to go into hibernation. Now, when it comes to hormones, like hormones are, one way of thinking about hormones is they're a free-floating neurotransmitter in the body. So that when we have a sudden influx of hormones, whether it's a woman going through a cycle or a pregnant woman, or sometimes men can go through certain types of hormone fluxes. When that happens, it's like the whole body becomes an extension of the brain because you get these added neurotransmitters flooding the brain, which, many of you, if you've ever been around someone who's pregnant, they are more sensitive to smells, to touch, to other sensations. They tend to be far more emotional, and this is not because they're out of control, it's because their body is flooding them with increased sensations. So everything literally is hyped up. So if my brain is already in a depressed state, it's already seeing the environment as hopelessly kind of dangerous, then if these hormones come in, it will likely only further add to that because it's going to make everything seem even bigger and even scarier and even more intense than I was already perceiving them. So does that help answer one of the reasons that hormones can actually play a role in depression or anxiety is they enhance almost all of the five senses.
Yeah, that was perfect. Thank you.
Okay.
I have a question.
Yes.
This information is really great to how we can help like ourselves, but how can we use this to help other people when they're struggling?
Right. I really appreciate that one because it turns out all of us have this need, right? Every one of us has a need for connection. Like every one of us, if we wait anywhere from 8 to 10 to 12 hours, we're going to start to feel hungry, right? Our brain stem is going to start communicating to other parts of our brain. We're going to actually experience pain, and we call that pain hunger, right? As sensory inputs coming from our gut. All of us have a very similar thing, even all the way from our hindbrain in different parts like the reticular formation, that actually drive us to connect socially. Like, and if we're not connecting socially, we will start feeling socially hungry, and we call that loneliness. Loneliness is supposed to be there. If we're feeling lonely, it's very easy for our security guard to interpret that painful loneliness as we're in a dangerous situation. It's time to withdraw. You probably have seen, maybe friends or family members, that when they get into that pain, they have a tendency to withdraw, because that would be appropriate. If they're a grizzly bear and the situation's hopeless, they need to withdraw and just go sleep for 18 hours a day, and then just restfully roll around in bed for the other few hours of the day. It's a very healthy response. But most of the time, in fact, depression's not even possible when we're physically safe. So depression is simply the brain misinterpreting the environment as dangerous, when it's physically dangerous, when it's probably more like emotionally dangerous. So how can we help? One is recognize that. And if we're talking about someone in mild depression, someone who's just kind of the mild level, self-help, things like this, just giving them some skills to get out of that, can be very effective and very useful. But once somebody's moved from just a mild depression more into a moderate or severe level, what we know is their frontal lobes are hijacked. Like, they're kind of in a limbic, kind of that non-conscious region of the brain has taken over. And it's very difficult, and at the severe level, impossible for them to just step outside of this themselves. They need somebody else to come in. So one is having a lot of compassion and not giving up on people. They may literally not be able to see hope, right? That's a full dorsal vagal parasympathetic hibernation response. They can't see hope. Their brain is not looking for hope. They're supposed to be kind of hunkered down and sleeping in bed, not looking for positive things. So trying to encourage them to look for positive things literally won't help them. What can help them, if you have a good relationship, is to just continually let them know, hey, I'm here for you. Sometimes if you know this is a person that has a history of depression and they go through depressive episodes, you guys might actually plan in advance how you want to handle that. I know that some people handle it by asking their loved ones, hey, when I start going in a depressive episode, what I need more than anything is for you to ignore my pleas to leave me alone. In other words, when I'm in a depressed state, I need you to literally take me by the hand, pull me out of bed, and take me to do something, because I will not be able to do it by myself, and I will not be able to be happy that you're dragging me out, but please ignore my frustration at you, ignore all that for that time period. If you have a great relationship with someone, you can become their frontal lobes. So even if they're hijacked and their frontal lobes are offline in depression, you can become their frontal lobes. But part of it's just planning that out, knowing how they experience depression. You can be there for them in the way that is helpful. They can help design that. I'm sure that there's some other questions with that. What other things are you thinking in how to help people?
That was a great question, by the way. That was very helpful. How do you get people, like I have a person that I know that people are always bringing them the problems of their life and it overwhelms them.
Yes.
What can you do to help there?
So, and maybe some of you are that person. Maybe you're the person that people have found you to be safe. They've really appreciated how you listen, and they come and they just dump everything on you. One is really learn your own limitations. You're not going to be able to continue. And you can actually, here's a really good way to know if you're getting dumped on too much, if people are sharing too much information from their difficulties. Here's how to know. If you're starting to feel resentful towards that person, you need to make better boundaries with them. You need to teach them that you actually, while maybe you initially said, hey, you can come to me anytime, that you've learned something about yourself, that you do want to hear some of their problems sometimes, but you need to set up new boundaries to say, sometimes I can't. My brain gets overwhelmed and I stop listening to you. So getting really clear on boundaries can be helpful, because you don't want to resent the person. You want to love them. So teach them that. I want to love you. I don't want to resent you. And so this is what I would like to do for you. I can listen to you for an hour. We can go out on an, I guess none of us get to go out and do that right now, but we can have a chat session for an hour once night or once a week, whatever it happens to be for you. But making sure that boundary is really clear, that I love you, therefore I want to listen to you, and this is how much I can listen to you. And if it's going into these other areas, what resources can I help you get connected with? What other questions do you have about that?
I guess this person that I know just is very, well, one person will call, then the next person will call, then the next person will call, and it's just so overwhelming for them.
Right. So this is someone, I mean, it sounds like this person might be in kind of that hijacked state. They're relying heavily on others to regulate for them. So one is just getting really clear, each person that's in their life, maybe they work together with the person and say that we need to decide what is helpful and where we do need to involve somebody else, so that we all don't start resenting this person, because that can easily happen. And that's probably the last thing this person needs is to be further isolated. So letting them know that, hey, we want to be there for you at this much, and I'm willing to take calls from you until about 10 o'clock, but I need to get sleep, otherwise I don't respond well, and I start getting grouchy myself. So you're welcome to call me until about 10 o'clock. Who could you call after 10 if you're having a hard time? And there's some great resources. Before we get done here, maybe I'll pull some of those up right now. I want to show you some other resources, especially if they're a student or an employee at the university. We have some really good resources that you can point them towards. So I'm going to share my screen again real quick here. One of them is the TAO, the Therapy Assistant Online, and this is free for all students. We've already paid for your subscription, so all students and employees of the university can go here, and there are a lot of resources on TAO. So this can be something that, in addition to being a good friend, they could also go to here to TAO, and they can monitor their mood. They can take measures of anxiety and wellness, and they can learn other strategies for self-soothing when they don't have other people around. There's also some, click here, because of COVID-19, TAO is even offering some free resources for people who aren't affiliated with the university or don't have a subscription. They can go there and get some free ideas about mindfulness. They can go there and get some, there's a little video that just gives it a basic idea of how someone might begin coping with COVID-19 and the isolation that social distancing is bringing upon people. These are great resources. Other ones might be, I guess I didn't have them here, but other resources you can direct them to are, if someone calls 211 in Idaho, they can get connected to the crisis line, and they can actually talk to somebody at any time, 24 hours a day, somebody here in Idaho that knows the resources that are available, and they can help them through. Maybe it's the middle of the night and they just need some other human voice to talk through with them what they're struggling with. But using those kind of resources and making sure, hopefully one of the difficulties that sometimes happens here in our community is people are so willing to be Christ-like and want to be of good help to others that they might start doing things like helping with watching a student or someone that, and put them on suicide watch, where roommates are taking turns being with that person to keep them safe. I want to emphasize that if somebody needs to be on suicide watch, they need professional help. That is not the role of ward members or roommates or friends or faculty. That's not their role. They need professional help if they need to be on suicide watch. Being there for someone emotionally and talking about suicide, that's very different than making sure a person doesn't complete a suicide. If they're at that level, they need professional help. Don't promise them that you'll keep those things a secret. Help them get connected. Again, you yourself could call 211 and say, hey, I have a friend who's struggling. Can you give me some ideas? They can talk you through ways that you might be able to be with that person, and get them the kind of resources they need so that they aren't causing their loved ones around them to start resenting them. Does that help? Do you have more questions about that?
That's awesome. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. We have about 3 more minutes if there's any other questions. Or also if there are topics, so we get to meet one more time this semester at the same time next week. I know that one I didn't get to today that I was asked last time is some ideas specific to social anxiety. So I have that on the list to talk about next week. Is there any other topics that someone would want me to cover in a future session here?
I mean, I have a question. I don't know if you could cover this in the next meeting, but it's just kind of like, because I've heard that some people just need medication, but some
Yes.
people only need counseling, not medication, but some people need a combination of both. So
Right.
like, what does each of, like, what is medication and then counseling, like, how does that affect your brain, or how does that help you yourself be, get out of that depressive mode? Like, what are the roles?
Mm-hmm. So thank you. That's a beautiful question. And yes, I can address more of that next time. But a real quick primer is yes, our brains all start out differently. Like if we're talking about the security guard, our amygdala alone, just that part of the brain looks very different in each of us. For some of us, we have much larger amygdalas. We're far more prone, our brains are far more prone to find the environment as dangerous. There's advantages to that. People who are more prone to see the environment as dangerous are often also better caretakers. So there's an advantage there, but it requires added care and taking care of those things. There are other things, biological reasons, and maybe from past history because of abuse or difficult situations growing up, that our brains really are not equal. So sometimes the medication that we have is to kind of help the brain compensate for the stresses it's going through. So none of the medications that we have actually heal mental illness or emotional difficulties, but they do help us cope with the system, like with the symptoms. So they can be a really good bridge for some people who maybe because of situations I've been hijacked and I'm depressed, and so medication might help me for 6 months to a couple of years get to a new place where I have a different relationship with my own self. And that's how we know it works best usually, is combining medication and either self-help or psychotherapy. We combine those two, and that's the most effective use. For some people, there are certain mental health issues that we don't have. There's no amount of counseling that is going to correct the problem. So there are some things when we get into things like bipolar disorder, especially type 1, or some forms of OCD or schizophrenia, that we know medication will probably need to be a part of the person's lifestyle for the rest of their life until and unless we come up with future ways to manage those. But for the current time, there'll be something that the person will probably want to be using their whole life. But I'll make sure I take note and talk more about when you might know if you or the people you care about should consider medication. And if you come with questions on, well, what are some of the risks, what are the downsides, what are the upsides, then I could answer those questions as well.
Brother Johnson, do you mind also tossing in there like alternative therapies in case medication isn't really an option for people?
Yes.
Thank you.
So I will definitely address, so those three things next time: social anxiety, strategies to manage that, and medication and alternative therapies beyond just psychotherapy. So great. Well, thank you very much. I'm going to throw my contact information up here again as we close. Just if anybody is interested, you can contact me directly if you have some questions, or you can go to Fearless if you want to find out more about what I even mean when I'm talking about the security guard and lizard brain, anterior cingulate, those kind of things. You can go there to find out more, or of course there's Tau. But thank you very much, and I'll look forward to seeing you guys next week. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.